Nate, we're live.
Hey everyone, my name is Nate McGackie. I'm the Executive Director of Arts North Carolina. I want to thank you all for coming out for this webinar, Reopening the Arts in North Carolina. I know there is a lot of interest in this particular topic. Welcome to those of you that are on the webinar, as well as those following along on Facebook. I do want to mention that this webinar is going to be posted on the Arts North Carolina website. Specifically at our newly launched page, the Arts Open Resources, so that all the resources that we're collecting from national partners are going to be housed there, including this webinar, maybe some others, and this document that we're talking about, reopening in the arts in North Carolina. So I want to thank everybody that worked so hard on creating this document. And now I get to introduce you to some incredibly smart people that are going to be doing today's webinar. The first is Vicki Vitiello. She is the Director of Operations and Arts Learning at the North Carolina Arts Council. We also have Angie Hays, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Theater Conference. And they will be joined by Fernando, who is the Executive and Artistic Director for the Wilson Center in Wilmington, North Carolina at Cape Fear Community College, and also the President of the North Carolina Presenters Consortium. So I will hand it over to them, and thank you all so very much for today.
Thanks, Nate. Hi, everybody. This is Vicki Vitiello. I am the Director of Operations and Arts Learning at the North Carolina Arts Council. I am so happy to be here today. I have to say, this feels to me like talking about reopening the arts sector might be the first step towards getting our feet back on solid ground. And for me, that is a very hopeful, positive feeling. So I appreciate all the good energy. The purpose of this presentation is to give an overview of a newly published document that's called A Guide to Reopening the Arts in North Carolina. I hope that you've had a chance to review it. It came out on Monday, so it's fairly timely. And it's been shared in a number of different ways, but we'll just make sure that everybody has access to it if you haven't had a chance to review it yet. We are going to spend some time going over that document and just giving you the basics of what is in there. The document was compiled over the past several weeks by a group of arts leaders from different disciplines from around the state. And Angie, Shane, and I were part of that working group. I'm so grateful to have them here with me today to help present this information and to answer questions. It's been a remarkable team effort from the beginning. And so the plan today is that Angie, Shane, and I have 6 slides to share with you, 7 if you count this Reopening the Arts title page. We're going to get straight to the details, and then afterwards we will answer questions, or more likely we will explore some questions with you that may not yet have answers, because like with everything else these days, we are kind of figuring this thing out together as we go, right? We are creative, smart people, problem solvers in the arts. I'm so grateful for that. Yeah, next slide, please, Nate. That's good. So a little more context about the guide to reopening the arts in North Carolina. Fundamentally, the guide is meant to help arts facilities and programs make informed decisions about their response to COVID-19 and to minimize the risk of exposure to both staff and patrons who are in their care. We developed the document to be used within the framework of Governor Cooper's phased approach to easing restrictions. And I heard this morning that Governor Cooper is going to be doing a press conference at 5 this afternoon, where he will announce exactly when the state is entering phase 2. We're currently in phase 1, as you all know. Based on earlier announcements, we believe that arts organizations of all kinds will be eligible to reopen in phase 2 with some kind of capacity restriction and of course social distancing requirements. Those details should be made available later this afternoon when the governor makes his announcement. We have requested that the phasing policies include specific language that relates to our arts sector so that we don't have to interpret whether or not we are an entertainment venue or should follow guidelines for retail businesses or whatever. We'd love to see the words museum and performing arts center in those policies. So fingers crossed that hopefully that will happen when we see those later today. As I mentioned before, the guide was created with input from leaders from many arts disciplines. And what we discovered is that while there are some very nuanced and specific challenges that each discipline has, most of the reopening considerations are relevant for everyone. All of us are dealing with messaging. All of us are dealing with health and safety issues. If we have a space, we will be sanitizing it. All of us are going to have to manage people during arts activities. And so those are the types of broad universal topics that this guide has. We want you to think of this document as a living document. This is kind of the first draft. We're absolutely certain that we will learn a great deal in the coming weeks, and we intend to keep updating the document as that learning happens so that it remains relevant, timely, helpful. In particular, I can imagine that last section of the guide growing quite a bit, because that is where we have started to list specific examples of strategies that arts organizations are trying during this reopen. So sharing those kind of successes are going to be absolutely key to making sure that the document serves its purpose. And then that last bullet right there is the address for the guide. It's going to live on the North Carolina Arts Council's website. Next slide, please, Nate. Perhaps the most important work that we can do is to help our audiences and patrons feel comfortable and safe so that they will continue to be our audiences and patrons. It is not new for us in the arts to help audiences to feel comfortable. We do it all the time. We are always striving to put people at ease and to make sure that they are confident about what to expect when they come into our spaces and when they experience our arts activities. And so this is really going to be a lot of the same kind of thinking. We're going to help our audiences know what to expect. And by helping them, we will be reassuring them that we are taking every precaution to keep them safe. And we will also begin to train them about how to train, sort of with quotes around it, how to behave differently while they're participating in the arts. Communication should be frequent and consistent. Website, social media channels, ticket purchasing avenues, emails, signage, curtain speeches, programs, all of it. Let's have the goal of over communicating, because again, we are both building and reinforcing those new expectations. And with all safety measures, do your best to make sure that the message is positive, practical, and proportionate. It's also important to remember that you are communicating with your internal audiences as well, not just your patrons. Make sure that your staff, your board, your volunteers get to hear and also might even get to speak about the new policies and the practices, because the goal is to normalize and gain buy-in for a new behavior, and that goes for everyone. Okay, so that leads me to the next point, which is we're going to have to anticipate and plan for the folks who don't buy in, if that makes sense. There will be additional customer service challenges as we deal with the public. Some of the challenges can be addressed with new signage, additional volunteers to answer questions, that front communication that you've done in advance. But you also will need to develop protocols for how your organization might deal with a patron who is disrupting the experience for others. And it will be good to think through that scenario in advance. Be prepared for something like that. And then one last thought for this slide. We recommend that arts groups within proximity of each other coordinate their communications about reopening. Around the state, we're seeing that this is happening in several communities. Asheville and Charlotte have been pretty awesome about it. Coordinating your message will amplify the message and ensure that everyone is consistent in what you're telling audiences, which is going to be very, very important to minimize the confusion and to establish that new sense of normal that we are all hoping for. Okay, so those are my 2 slides, and now I will turn things over to Shane Fernando.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Vicki mentioned, having our teams, our volunteers, our workforce involved in the process in terms of our education and protecting our guests and each other is the first step here. And one thing we must consider is all those who work in our buildings. Obviously, our staffs, our artists, our crews, our volunteers, our contractors and vendors who come and visit, and setting up a policy that fits for our venues. We all come in various shapes and sizes, and so I'll be running through some practices that we hope you can tailor to what your operation does. The first thing is having that designated point person who will oversee your organization's oversight of the response to COVID-19. And that might be an operations manager, a house manager, or for those one-person shops, it might be the ED just adding another thing to their job description of many things. But having that one person to process, develop, implement, assess the policies and procedures that you put in place is very important, and something that your staff, your workers, your volunteers can go to if there are questions or concerns, as well as guests. In terms of your practices, obviously social distancing will be a piece of our requirement for our reopening. And so not only within our guests must that be considered, but also those who work in our venues. And so going through the different work tasks that will be need to be accomplished at a daily basis. Some may not be possible to maintain that distancing. And so exploring other options in terms of protecting the people involved in that task. There's a section that talks about work pairing in terms of 2 people routinely working together but maintaining distance from others. Exploring those opportunities that allow you to get the job done, but to maintain appropriate social distancing whenever possible. Your personal protective equipment is definitely needed for your staff and volunteers, and also what expectation you need to explore for vendors and contractors who may be coming in and out of your building, and what are those expectations you may place on them needs to be explored, as well as gloves and other types of items that you may consider using. And also to always remember, gloves are not a replacement for hand washing or substitute, but are used for health checks and other types of sensitive things, and then disposed of appropriately and not reused. One thing that was mentioned yesterday, which I on another call, was having the cleaning supplies out, not only for your cleaning staff, but in certain areas for your staff to use, possibly for your guests to use, and involving them in the process of sanitizing and making your efforts visible. And so I think that is something, I thought that was a wonderful point that was shared, and something that, again, showing that this is a work of all of us in the community to protect each other. It's also important to have in place a documentation and a process, documentation process and a practices process if and when a sick worker or volunteer is identified. And so having in place, how will you document this? Are you able to designate a place for isolation. If someone does come down with fever, does arrive to work with a fever, or becomes ill while on the job. Also considering a phone tree process of some sort to notify those if you're a part of a larger institution, also your local health authorities, and then any workers, volunteers, and guests who may be exposed. It would be very helpful having that process in place in advance if that circumstance did arrive. And also being aware of those legal implications of protecting identities of those who might be infected. And so being able to know the proper reporting protocols. And so I would definitely connect with your local health department to make sure that you don't inadvertently expose someone's identity in a wrong way and jeopardize their privacy to health. Next slide, please. And then, the other large piece in terms of your venue is what I, would recommend is creating, we all have these, but walking through our guest journey into the building, starting with parking, where do they park, bike racks, etc., and following that path into the building. If there's any type of screening, any counters, any scanning areas, through your lobbies, identifying those doorways that can be propped open to minimize touch, all the way into the seating areas, and developing a sanitation plan for those high touch areas. Also, identifying your worker journey through the building from outside from where they may park into the building, if they have to check in any type of kiosk or clock-in area, and their work areas, and developing a regular sanitation plan for all of those high-touch areas. So it would be very important to pull your staff, crew, volunteers together to be part of this process to help identify those high-touch and sanitized areas that need attention. Not only front of house, but also back of house in terms of stage area, your technical equipment, microphones, and other types of high-touch areas on the stage, and definitely consulting with the manufacturer's requirements in terms of sanitizing. Very important, as well as our computers and so forth. Knowing which wipes are appropriate to use on computers and so forth. Some are made for electronics, some are not. So being sensitive to also protecting your assets while sanitizing. And also knowing the difference between cleaning and disinfecting. Disinfecting necessarily does not clean a surface, and cleaning necessarily does not disinfect. So knowing that both those processes might be having to be put in place, like cleaning grime or dirt on a handrail and then disinfecting that handrail. But knowing what your process is, knowing what cleaning supplies are appropriate to disinfect, and also there are areas that may not be touched or visited by people and in a 72-hour period, which has been identified as how the virus becomes naturally neutralized within that time. Also, it's very important not only for legal reasons, but also just in terms of developing, as part of your process, a documentation of cleaning and sanitizing, in terms of having that checklist initial, having whoever your person is oversight, your point person at your operation, being able to review that documentation on a regular basis to ensure that all the sanitation processes that you put into place are being adhered to, and identifying any changes within that checklist as needed. And with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thanks Shane and Vicki. This is Angie Hays with the North Carolina Theater Conference. And so as we begin to think about bringing the public and our patrons into our buildings, we really need to focus on minimizing the number of physical transactions that take place during an audience member or patron's visit. The fewer transactions that we can make, the less likely it is to spread the virus. We also want to make sure our patrons have the resources they need to help us promote safety. We want them to be fully engaged in this process, and as Vicki said, that requires a lot of communication from us. It's going to be important to have hand washing stations or sanitizer stations, and whenever possible, those should be no touch activated. And it will be super important for our supervisors to make sure that those are regularly cleaned and refilled, and that we have adequate resources. Most box office windows are generally well protected already, but not everyone. So if you do have an open space type box office, you'll want to consider adding partitions if you can, and adding line spacing through the box office process. So depending on where your box office is located, whether it is indoors or outdoors, this may cause different concerns and different needs. When we talk about welcoming guests into our building, we are going to have most likely a completely different way that we go about doing that. So you're going to be thinking about marking lines on the ground, outside, using ropes and stanchions, working with your city officials, your local officials, your neighboring businesses to make sure you have appropriate signage. It will also be important to, again, be communicating with patrons who may be waiting outside of the building, letting them know what to expect as they approach the building, and making sure that you are communicating potential wait times. This is obviously something you'll want to consider communicating in advance of arrival, but also updating folks as they are waiting to enter your facility. You'll want to make sure that there is as much signage as possible, noting if you are requiring or if we are requiring face coverings, what the social distancing guidelines are. We shouldn't make assumptions that everyone is on the same page with those things. So we'll want to be communicating that to everyone as they begin the process of entering our spaces. It's also important to note that as we are implementing these new procedures and systems, that we need to remain compliant with disability laws and provide reasonably accessible events for all of our patrons. We may need to provide special accommodations if we are doing health screenings or for waiting areas, and you can work with your local advocates for people with disabilities. I would also recommend Arts Access. They do great work and will continue to be involved as we are developing plans. So just keep accessibility in mind as well. Thinking about restrooms, we are going to need to limit occupancy to ensure social distancing. Patrons may be required to wait outside of restroom doors. Again, you may need to have staff available to help enforce these policies. You'll need to have lines marked by physical barriers to avoid confusion and contact wherever possible. For our venues that do food and beverage service, it's recommended that nothing should be self-served at this time. So thinking about those opening night parties with the lovely buffet in the lobby, those things are not going to be appropriate at this time. All food and beverage should be served by staff who are wearing appropriate PPE. Prepackaged foods are preferable, but should only be served when concession staff can conduct those transactions with social distancing and minimizing touch points. And for our venues that operate restaurants on their premises, you should follow the guidelines for reopening restaurants. Nate, you can go to the next slide, please. So at the end of our reopening guide, you will see some examples of how arts organizations are starting to implement these new plans and restrictions, and some ideas that you can draw from. And this is another area where we may update the guide as we go, as we gather these great examples. But all of this is going to require us to ask some really big questions of ourselves and our industries. How will these safety measures affect our business model? Will we have to find ways to increase contributed income if safety restrictions are limiting the number of audience members we can welcome into our spaces and limiting our revenue? Will we be faced with decisions about raising ticket prices due to our increased costs of operations? How do we change our audience perceptions about what they will experience? And how do we modify our artist offerings to ensure safety for our artists, staff, and volunteers? You know, in theater, our 8-show-a-week model may not be sustainable if we need to offer more performances for fewer audience members. And how will our sector share what we've learned? As Vicki and Nate mentioned, we've had a great collaboration as we work on this document, and we did want to remind everyone that you have access to service organizations who are here to help communicate and connect you with peers and continue to share these resources. So I encourage you to get involved with Arts North Carolina and organizations like the North Carolina Presenters Consortium and the North Carolina Theater Conference. We also need to work with our local arts councils and our state arts council so that we can be in regular communication with our peers. It's important to communicate also with our funding partners about our new challenges, but also to share success stories and invite these partners to collaborate in this process as well. We want to make sure that we are communicating not just with our patrons, but with our funding partners, with our city and government partners, as well as our press partners, so that everyone is aware of what is happening and how the arts industry is responding. And we may find that there are new opportunities for partnerships or new audiences that we can reach in this shifting environment. We're all already exploring virtual programming. We may find that we have audiences who may be interested in shorter performances that don't involve restroom breaks or congregating in the lobby for intermission. We may find that we can offer more choices for showtimes if we are serving smaller audiences. And we have an opportunity to partner with other venues that may have a better setup for serving larger audiences, and we may be able to work with outdoor venues in new and exciting ways. So these are all things that we encourage you to think about. And I would also just like to remind everyone who's tuning in today, and we thank you all so much for tuning in, that Arts North Carolina is the host of our webinar. And Arts North Carolina is a nonprofit service organization, and we work with arts organizations across the state to provide resources, but we also communicate with elected officials. We're an advocacy organization. We have registered lobbyists that work on our behalf at the state legislature to make sure that there is adequate, as much as possible, funding for the arts and arts education policies for our schools. So if you are taking advantage of things like this webinar and documents and resources offered by Arts North Carolina, I hope you will join as an individual member or an organizational member. And we also have another fun and easy way that you can support the arts in North Carolina, which is by purchasing an arts license plate for your car. So your car can look great, and that money will help us advocate on your behalf at the state legislature. So thank you all.
So are we reaching time for questions, Vicki?
Yeah, I think we are.
Okay, there are a couple questions. I've got a couple interesting discussions going on Facebook right now. One of them talks about how to conduct things like rehearsals with artists. Are there guidelines in your guide about that? Because that's going to be crucial to having the concerts and the performances, is conducting rehearsals. Are there guidelines in your guide about that?
So no, not specifically. We did not pull out rehearsals in any kind of targeted way. But I wonder, Angie, if you and the theater conference membership have been talking about that in some way.
Yes, we definitely have. And we will say that this guide is purposefully not touching on every possible scenario. You will find other guides, some of which we took inspiration from, that are 80, 100 pages long, and there are some great resources available. We wanted to create just sort of a starting point, something a little smaller in scale, but we recognize that we're not addressing every single issue. I would recommend checking out a guide called the Event Safety Alliance Guide. They have a very detailed look at backstage protocols. And you can also expect in the coming months a guide from Actors Equity Association, which is our professional union for theater actors, stage managers. And we're expecting other guides from other groups as well. So these are conversations that are ongoing. I do know at NCTC, we are gathering our members to talk through these very issues to see what folks are considering and what might work well. NCPC is gathering membership as well to have these virtual discussions. So you can expect to hear more from those service organizations. And if you do want an even more in-depth look at handling issues on stage and backstage, I would recommend checking out the Event Safety Alliance Guide.
Thanks, Angie. And that guide is also available on the Arts North Carolina website as well. If you want to go to our website, we have a page on opening the arts that will have a link to this guide that Vicki and her group put together, and also the event services guide and other kinds of resources. There is a question here about summer camps, and we talked about that a little bit in the webinar this morning. And I know that we got some suggestions on some guides for that, and letting you know that we will be putting that up on our Open Arts page as well. Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about outdoor events. There's some interest on Facebook among people about outdoor events. Needless to say, that's going to be an easier, more easily managed situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is Vicki. Well, let me go back to the summer camp question just really quickly. The North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services has been really specific about guidance on camps, both summer camps and both day camps and sleepaway camps. So I would recommend they have a specific guide for day camp and programs serving teens and children. That gives a lot of good information about how to run those programs safely. So outdoor events are really interesting. I think that many of us are looking to outdoors, as Angie mentioned, as a way to, kind of a way to reimagine some of our programs, because it is less likely that the virus is transmitted during outdoor programming. However, outdoor venues are as diverse as any other kind of venue. Some outdoor venues are kind of wide open and vast, and there's a lot of room for social distancing and opportunities for people to remain safe. Some outdoor venues are just like indoor venues without a roof. So we're going to have different situations with different venues. Pardon me. I do think that the opportunity that outdoor programming provides for more peace of mind is going to give them a pretty good leg up as well on doing that kind of programming. Any thoughts, Shane or Angie, about outdoor programming?
There are some similarities just in terms of, again, that guest journey. Obviously, the crews will face very similar circumstances in indoors in most cases. I think also having those documentation processes, there is a lot of crossover, and then in many ways there are a lot of things that don't apply. But I think a lot of the things that preparation, that fits for your venue is, I guess, most important.
It'll be interesting to see if the governor's policies address that specifically. I mean, there are specific guidance that we received for state parks that might be applicable for some of the outdoor programs, but I'm looking forward to seeing if phase 2 has something specific about outdoor performing arts venues. Any other questions?
Yes, some people have been asking about sources for supplies for these personal protective equipment supplies and cleaning supplies. I know some of those have been kind of hard to come by. We had a couple people post some resources in the Zoom group, but there are people also asking on Facebook. So why don't you guys talk about what you know about reliable sources for these supplies?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. And this might be where we get our hive mind working together, and anybody who has a good source can share. I heard during the Museums and Partnership meeting last week that I attended that the Dogwood Health, I think it's called the Dogwood Health Trust in Asheville, is actually providing PPE for small businesses in that region. So some of these supplies might come from interesting new partners. But I'm not, I don't know. I'm going to turn to Shane and Angie to hear if they've got any other suggestions.
It's definitely going to be one of the biggest challenges that we face as we try to get ready to reopen. And I think that we'll need to be sharing resources with one another. But no, I don't have anything specific to offer at this time. If you have resources, please drop them in the group chat. We'd love to grab those and share them out. Thank you.
And yes, same here. We're part of a larger institution, and so a lot of things are being sourced elsewhere, but there are still some challenges in finding things. And actually, one thing that we have been working on with our volunteer corps and other staff is the sewing of the face masks that you put the inserts in. So we should have, by the time we reopen, we hope enough masks, but it's been really wonderful in the way that people can support the venue and still be involved in our operation.
Okay, and there's a question on Facebook about the legal liability for organizations and infections that might occur as a result of people attending a performance. Do you have any guidance that you can give organizations about that?
So I think we'll start by saying that none of us are lawyers, but I believe that the safest measures that you can take to protect yourself is that you will have to demonstrate that you have followed the recommended policies for reopening and that you are in compliance. And so I guess when Shane was doing his presentation, he remarked on documentation of disinfecting and cleaning, that kind of documentation of all of these different measures that we are taking is going to be our most important protection that we can take against any kind of liability that might be out there. I do not think that we are putting ourselves at risk for litigation just by opening up to the public, as long as we are taking appropriate measures to stay safe.
And if I may add, just to reinforce, also just within that process and confirming with your local authorities, if an infection does occur, how do you protect and what do you need to do to protect that individual's?
You're saying, Shane, that if someone is sick, you're protecting that individual's privacy? Is that what you're saying? Yes.
So confirming with your local authorities, local health authorities, on how, if an infection does occur, obviously it's probably not appropriate to use their name, and who can know that name, and all of that in terms of when you build your process, in terms of HIPAA laws, that's definitely be an area of liability, is knowing how to handle a potential guest or worker who may be infected or ill in your venue, and how to maintain their privacy. Building that in as part of your plan and connecting with your local health authority about that process is very important.
Here's a follow-up question about whether or not your guide has samples of appropriate documentation for cleaning, or if you've got links or things to resources that might guide people to that.
That's a good recommendation. The guide does not currently have that, but it could have it as early as tomorrow.
Great. Now, I don't know if this may be slightly outside of your realm, but there are a lot of people on Facebook talking about the size limitations having to do with phase 2 and 3 of opening up. I don't know if you've been in communication with the governor's office, but I think people are concerned about the economic viability of a less than full house, and what percentage of the audience can be present in each phase is probably going to have a big financial implication on some of these organizations.
Yes, we are very concerned as well, and we are interested to see what comes from the governor's office with the new phases. We don't have any concrete insight about what those announcements will be. As Vicki said, we have been advocating on behalf of the industry, but everyone that has been involved with this plan, we know that everything we have shared will come with a cost and will be difficult to implement, and we are very concerned as well, and we're very interested to see what those size and audience size recommendations will be. But we are working with the assumption that social distancing, even in our theater spaces, will be required for quite some time.
Do you have, I was going to say, do you have any different, are there any different guidelines for, say, visual arts organizations or museums who are not necessarily putting everyone in one room all at the same time, but have kind of a different model? Do you have any guidelines for them?
So this is Vicki. The guidance is the same. I mean, it's might be easier for some facilities to accommodate their patrons because of the way that buildings are laid out, like a museum, for example, where you're not trying to put everybody into a performing space where they're sitting side by side in an audit, watching a performance. But the rules are pretty much the same. It really is about capacity of, so the rules might come out. I don't know that this is true, but the governor might say, venues can have up to 25% of their fire code capacity, as long as they can have social distancing within that. And so that would be the same, for museums as with performing arts venues. The business model for museums tends to be a little bit kind of easier to adjust to these restrictions than the business model for the performing arts sector. And that's kind of where the really creative thinking has to come in. We've heard from some larger venues, performing arts venues, that they may not reopen at all while there is a restriction on the audiences. They might not be able to make the money work. We've heard from some museums that they're eager to open the minute that they can, that they have figured it out, and they're ready to open with kind of a fanfare and celebration that they're back in business. So each individual scenario is going to be different, and it's going to be difficult to make it work. But I am hopeful that we are a creative lot here in the arts, and we have overcome a lot of different challenges over the years for how to help audiences find us and be impacted by us. And I think that in that spirit, we're going to be able to figure a lot of this stuff out as well. It's just going to be different.
Okay, I don't think there's that many more questions. Hang on a second. Yeah, the only other thing is somebody was talking on Facebook. You know, there are groups that are involved at schools, various schools, theater departments, band, chorus, on both the K-12 level and also on a collegiate level. And this person is wondering, where's the responsibility here in those situations? Is it the responsibility of the larger institution to have, to provide the PPE and to create those guidelines and figure all of that out? Or do you think it's going to be part of the departments? And of course, I know this is going to happen on every level, but have you heard, I know, Angie, you are in touch with a number of educational organizations. Have you heard any guidelines about how people are going to be handling that in those educational institutions?
Sure. There are not a lot of guidelines coming out just yet from our K-12 school districts or colleges in regards to performing arts spaces. Obviously, whatever those guidelines are, you will need to follow those for your school district or your college campus. It's going to be important that the folks who typically run the arts spaces on campus work in partnership with the administration. Our school administrators are dealing with many, many things that they are trying to work through to keep our students safe. So it's going to be great if you can be a resource to them and say, here are some things I've learned about what's happening in the nonprofit arts industry and the performing arts industry, and come with solutions. If you can say, I've worked through this, I've come up with a seating chart, I've found some PPE equipment that we might have access to, that will be a step towards being able to produce in your space if you can be a partner with your administration. It's going to be everyone's responsibility to keep our audiences safe. It'll be the school district's responsibility. You will play a role in that, parents will play a role in that, and students will as well. So it's always best if you can be a resource and have solutions before they're even asked of you. So now is a great time to be putting together your own plans, knowing that you may be given restrictions that just do not allow you to have performances, but it's great if you can be on the front side of those discussions and make sure that when your administrators are ready to hear from you, you are prepared and ready to be a partner.
Okay, if anyone else has any other questions, go ahead and type them in now. While we're waiting for questions, does any of you have anything else you want to add, Vicki or Shane?
I just want to echo what Vicki said. These are very difficult conversations indeed, but we are a creative sector. I have been so incredibly impressed with the way our arts organizations have converted to virtual programming so quickly, and we will get through this together. Nobody is under pressure to open before you are ready. We want to open one time. So let's work together to make sure we do this the right way and take care of each other. And we are here for you, and we believe in you, and we're grateful for your partnership.
Well, I don't see any other questions. Shane, did you have something to say?
I'll just follow up. Just important to remember that these are recommendations. We hope that you take the best kind of practices, the nuggets that will work for you, because we know one size does not fit all. And also, you know, to feel free to share what innovations you might develop with the field as well, because we are all in this together.
All right, and yeah, we've got some people posting some resources on Facebook, and so we're going to try to take some of those resources and put them on our page as well. Just to reiterate, all of the organizations that are involved here today, the North Carolina Arts Council, the North Carolina Presenters Consortium, the North Carolina Theater Conference, all can be resources for you, as well as Arts North Carolina. We have a lot of information up on our website. Oh wait, we have one question about museums interested in creating virtual programming. Vicki, do you have anything at the Arts Council, any virtual programming guides that people might be able to access on your website?
Yes, we do. We have, it's, I think that it's the guidance that we've created was specifically designed for individual artists who are looking to make virtual content, sort of a tips and tricks for artists, but that could be used by anybody. It's on our COVID-19 resources page off of the homepage of the North Carolina Arts Council. I think that many of our arts organizations have found some interesting success in creating virtual work, and maybe our reopenings are sort of these hybrids of some continuation of that virtual work, as well as, you know, finding ways to bring maybe smaller groups into our venues, or there's going to be interesting experimentation. And what we have learned during the pandemic, I think, is going to just make our arts programming that much stronger as we go forward.
Thanks for that. I had a feeling you had some resources there. Someone else asked about, and I think their question is specific about having a small group be in the facility before they open, but I think this opens up a larger question about often facilities rent out their spaces to other organizations or other groups to use. What would be your recommendations for people who are doing that?
I think that the recommendations are the same. I think that you need to in your agreements, your rental agreements, you need to clearly outline the expectations for sort of how your building use is to happen.
I would completely agree, Vicki. And also, at the end of the day, if that group is not following the appropriate rules in your facility, there could be some liability issues there.
That's good information. So I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Nate, do you have any other things that you'd like to add? Nate? We may have lost Nate.
No, Nate was
Okay.
just having issues with his microphone. No, just I want to thank Christine and Vicki and Angie and Shane for all of that fantastic information. You know, obviously this is, as we've said several times, this is the beginning of a process. And these are suggestions and guides, and we're all going to be making some decisions for our own organizations and our own venues moving forward. And I think this conversation is a really great place to start. So thank you all for putting this together and for this document and for all the great work you do.